I'm Sam Roach Gerber. I am your moderator for the evening, and I am vice president of VSET, Vermont Center. Oh, thank you. Golf claps. Thank you. So this is our 8th season, which is crazy. We've been doing this since 2016. We have a lot of first timers in the audience, so I want to get a little history lesson there. And each event, we focus on a different industry or topic. And this one is a little far outside of the VSET comfort zone. But people love to read, so why the hell not, right? Yay. So you may have noticed that we have 2 speakers up here instead of 3. Unfortunately, Brianna Colleen, who is a total badass and someone we will definitely bring back, woke up from a nap with a 102 fever an hour ago. So send Brianna all of the healing vibes, but good looks on her keeping us healthy. But we're going to have enough yamming from these 2 that you won't even notice. It's going to be great. So please help me in welcoming Lindsay Stoddard and Miranda Beverly Whittemore. And before we get started, I just want to thank Hotel Vermont and the Media Factory for helping us do these events. We've partnered since the very beginning. Hotel Vermont is our host, and they make everything run super smooth, and then Media Factory films it so that this event is accessible to everyone, everywhere for free. So we will send around that link for anyone you know that couldn't make it tonight. They'll be able to watch it. So don't mess up.
No pressure.
Yeah, so no pressure. So I like to kick off with having y'all just sort of introduce yourselves. Tell us about who you are and what you write. Lindsay, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Lindsay Stoddard. I am a middle grade author. I write novels for middle grade readers. So my main characters are in 5th and 6th grade, if that helps. They're marketed for like 9 to 12-ish age range. I grew up here in Vermont, and I taught middle school for 12 years in New York City, and now I live back here in Vermont with my family in Shelburne, which is where I was born and raised. So that's that. Yeah.
Awesome. And how many books have you written?
5 have been published. I have 5.
Amazing.
How many have you written?
Ugh.
Oh, that's a great question.
Body count?
Right. I from the time I was a little kid, countless stories, like the stapled together pieces of paper novels that I wrote. But I have completed at least 3 or 4 manuscripts that have not been published.
Yeah. I want to read those.
Right. I think they're great.
Are they weird?
There are little pieces of them in there, I will say.
Nice. Yeah. Hi.
Hi, I'm Miranda Beverly Whittemore. Can you hear me? I feel like can you guys hear me? I write adult fiction. I write books that are I kind of describe them to people as like books at the crossroads of literary and commercial. So they're books that I like to bring on vacation. Books where there's a big plotty thing that happens, sometimes often a murder, and then but then also hopefully enjoyable to read in terms of like the level of language. My novel Bittersweet, my 3rd novel, was marketed by my marketing department both in Us Weekly and The New Yorker. So I feel like that kind of is like, those are the books I write. And I've written 5 novels, and I published 5 novels, and I've written 8 novels, so kind of the same. Yeah. I think that's always important to talk about because I think especially for people who are starting out, there's this idea that you like write a novel and it's published, and it's a lot longer than that. I lived in... Part of my childhood I spent here, and then I was also in Oregon and in Senegal and West Africa. Went to college at Vassar in Poughkeepsie and met my life partner there, and we moved to New York where he grew up, and we lived there for 20 years. And then in June of 2020, we moved back here.
Yay.
Also in Shelburne, and our children are both in the same grade at Shelburne Community School.
You get such a neatly packaged story. I love it. Mm-hmm. All right, thanks for coming.
Well, I was living it too.
I bet. Well, okay, so wasn't even going to ask this, but now this is why we're here. I don't know any of this stuff. So, written and not published. Does that mean you're still trying to get it published? You don't want it published? What does that mean for people that?
No one will buy it.
Yeah.
Or like their books, like one of the books is the first book I ever wrote, which is a novel in verse. So it's I think probably when I'm like 80, someone will publish it, hopefully. And then one of them is a book that I wrote after a really big career kind of like crash and burn, where I was kind of told I didn't have a career anymore because my books had sold so terribly. And so I wrote another book to try to sell it, and I couldn't sell it. And then, but that book is now kind of like been repurposed or I guess kind of composted into the book I'm currently writing and we'll hope to sell soon.
Yeah, that was like part of my question is like, are they sitting on the shelf and is it a sad thing, or do you use it to repurpose? Is it motivational? Like what? I don't know, Lindsay, maybe you can touch on that.
I have similar. The first manuscript that I finished, the first full manuscript, I couldn't get an agent to be interested in it, and I was a full-time teacher at the time, so I didn't have a lot of like, I'm going to go back in and keep working on it and revise and keep going. So I did put it aside for a little bit. And then when I started to write my second novel, I went back to that manuscript and I pulled out the setting because I knew I wanted to write a New York City book, and so I used that. I pulled out one of my favorite characters, who's the secondary character that shows up in Right as Rain, and so I did some composting with that as well. And then the other two books that I've written and are not published are current. Like one's out in the world with my agent. And one is being revised currently. So
awesome. I love that. So one of the things I wanted to ask you all about is like, as writers, do you feel that you are entrepreneurs? And before you answer that, I'm like, they both show up with a pile of their own books. Lindsay brought like a stack of her bookmarks. Miranda brought like a sign up for her newsletter. I'm like, yeah, you are entrepreneurs.
Writers have hustle.
we do.
Absolutely.
We have to hustle.
Yeah. And I think like that's kind of a good transition of like, books that have been published, books you've written that haven't yet been published, like hustling. Like tell us a little bit about that stuff you do that's not writing the book. Like once your book is out there or you're trying to get it published, like what does that look like from a work perspective for you?
Yeah. Completely honestly, I hadn't thought of the word like entrepreneur connected to me in any way until this panel. And now that I've been thinking about it, I'm like, oh my gosh, like I guess it is a little bit of a hustle and a business. But when I first started publishing, I was also...
That's my husband, everyone.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is David. Great guy. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's fine.
He's cool. Don't worry about it.
So when I first started publishing, I signed my first book deal with HarperCollins when I was 8 months pregnant with my first kid. So it was like I left teaching and I was starting a new like work from home full-time mom gig. And it was a lot of new and like a lot of exciting, but I could only really do the writing part of the writing career. And so I was kind of at home just writing and momming and hoping that like there was a publicist at HarperCollins and a marketing department that was doing all the stuff I didn't know how to do or I couldn't quite get out of the apartment to do. And so now my youngest has just started kindergarten and I'm like, oh, like I need to make some bookmarks and do like school visits and I can say yes to events and like I've got all this extra now and there are all these other parts of the career that I'm just starting to...
You do a lot of school visits.
I do a lot of school visits, yeah. That's a big part of being a writer for children is getting into classrooms like in kids' schools and that's honestly my favorite part. Like more than the writing even, I love being out in schools.
Well, as a teacher, I'm sure that like feels so natural to you too.
Yeah, and I miss it so much. I miss teaching, so it feels amazing. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. So my journey towards like this career has been quite long because I sold my first book in 2003. So I am like I've had like 20 years of being a writer, which is crazy. And I sold my first novel in a very different moment in the publishing world where there was a lot of money and I was a kid. I mean, I was 25 and I was 27 and they sold, I talk about money because I think it's really important to be really honest about it. I sold my first 2 books in a 2-book deal that was $400,000. And it was maybe like the most terrible thing that happened in my career because I couldn't live up to that expectation at all, sales-wise.
Yeah, that's brutal.
And it was at a time when, so my book came out, my book was bought like 6 months after The Lovely Bones came out. Do you guys remember
Oh,
the
yeah.
book? And I was billed as like my book was going to be the next Lovely Bones. And then the story of publishing is that people are constantly coming and going. And so my acquiring editor left 6 months before my first book came out. And the person who took my book over was not a big fan of that editor. And she's a very, very famous editor now. So I will not name her, but she kind of obviously did not love that the book had been acquired by him. And so kind of like that the people in who were supposed to be doing all that stuff, they just didn't exist for me. And so what happened was that my second book sold even worse, and then I basically didn't have a career anymore. So I had to kind of relaunch my career with my third novel, Bittersweet, which ended up becoming a New York Times bestseller, which was amazing. But what I learned from that experience was that it is so much luck, and it's so much just getting the stamp of approval from the right constellation of people, both in-house, which is like the terminology used to discuss people who are working within your publishing house, and then and then press. And then what's really interesting, the more you know about how this works, is that people who work in publishing don't know how to sell books. They don't know what sells a book. And they'll be honest with you. When I finally had my book on the New York Times bestseller list, and my publicist, who was the head of publicity at this really big publishing house, was sending me BookScan notices every week to be like, your book is going to be number 3. She was like, by the way, we have no idea how any of this happened. And it was both really exciting to feel, and then also like, oh, it doesn't really matter how much I do, right? So there is this sense of hustle, right? You can only do what you can do. And I try to say yes to the things that make me happy, similar to you. And I try with every book, I try to like take a stab at like doing something creative, marketing wise. And, you know, I have a newsletter, and I'm on Instagram, and I'm on TikTok. But honestly, like, is that going to make my book a bestseller? Probably not.
Yeah, it's funny because I've been thinking a lot about authors the last like month, and like going to websites. I was like, wow, I just never thought about all this stuff, because I think when you're just a consumer of books, like you go to the bookstore, or like a friend tells you about a book and you read it, right? So I'm like, yeah, you're right. I don't think I've ever read a book because I've followed that author somehow and they posted about their book. Like,
right.
Unless someone else is like, I just read this book, it's so good. Or, you know, I think it's really popular for people to be like, these are the books I read in 2024. And I'm like, I get it. Cindy read 50 books. I read 4.
But
whatever.
I think that's also generational, because TikTok Book Talk is insane. I mean, I don't know, are any of you on TikTok? Do any of you follow Book Talk? Like, the Book Talk situation is beyond.
I'm not on it yet.
It's wild. And like and what's really interesting about Book Talk is that it's often books that are backlist. So books that came out 10 years ago, that a group of like often Gen Z people are like,
Gen Z,
this
where
book
you
is
at?
amazing. And I mean, what's really interesting in that conversation, you should know, is that like in these publishing houses, people are saying like, how do we get it on Book Talk? Like that's
so funny.
and they don't know how.
Yeah.
Because they're all like 50.
Right. Oh, it's so good. I mean, also like going back to the entrepreneurship thing, like we talk about it all the time, like most of entrepreneurship is about timing. And it sounds like publishing a book is the same thing, right? It's like the right person, the right time. Like, are you just inspired and you write something based on the success of or failure maybe of a previous book? Or do you try to time it with something in our culture? I don't know.
Yeah. I think for me, I feel like it's hard to get through a novel. It's hard to write a novel from the beginning to the end. It takes me at least a year to get a draft. And so if I'm not writing something that like I have to be writing, like that I want to be writing and that I love, then I can't get through it. If I don't love the character or what I'm doing with the story, then I can't get through it. So I've had a lot of people recently say like, you know, we're looking for more commercial, or we're looking for like a younger series. And I'm sort of like, oh, like I don't, you know, how much do I try and tweak my writing to fit the market right now? And how much do I just write Lindsay Stoddard, like write what I write. That's my bread and butter. Like I write family, school, stories, friendships, like all the stuff that I know and love. And if I just keep doing that and hope that the door opens again for another one of my stories to walk through. And so for me, so far, I have stuck with just, this character. Like right now I'm writing a character named Calvin, and I just have to write a story. Like I have to get through it. And so I'm continuing to write it, whether it's commercial, it's probably not going to be a series. And so that's what kind of drives me to keep going through the difficult writing process.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And then who knows, by the end of the novel, like the market might shift again and they're not looking for a series.
Well, right. I mean, because
so,
from the time you write a novel to when it comes out, it's like 2 and now kind of like 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
So it's a long run.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that you asked this question because the book I'm working on right now, called Do It Yourself, is like this kind of revamp of a book that I wrote 15 years ago. When I wrote it 15 years ago, it was called The Plagiarist, and it's about one very, very famous writer who is like top of her game, supposedly, and except for this one thing, which is that this other novelist who is like in the depths of her depression and has only ever published one book, and it's kind of like no one ever read it and no one bought it. She knows that the most famous woman in the world plagiarized her novel. And so it's this question of kind of like how she can't follow any legal routes to get revenge. So she figures out how to basically infiltrate that woman's life and kind of ruin it.
Is this autobiographical or?
Sam.
Sorry.
So I wrote that 15 years ago and I tried to sell it, and I was told it was way too inside baseball by a lot of editors were like, it's too inside baseball. This is a time when no one thought anyone cared about what happened behind the closed doors of the publishing world. Well, right, like 2 years ago, the plot came out, and suddenly everybody was obsessed with this idea. Yellowface came out, that amazing article in the New Yorker or the New York Times Magazine called "Who is the Bad Art Friend?" Has anybody read this? Read it if you haven't. And my writing group of 3 other writers, all published, were like, you got to go back to The Plagiarist because those books are so hot right now. This is a concept that is like you have thought so much about. You wrote a whole novel about this. It's so interesting that you've thought about this and you have this perspective on it that we haven't read. You should read it. You should go back to the book and reread it. And so we all read it together, and then we thought about it. And that book was set in like 2007. It was like too close to be historical fiction and too, it was like in this weird spot of like, what is this? And they were like, no, you have to just like write it from the beginning. And so I've rewritten the book basically with the same kind of central conceit. So it's like this weird thing where that's a book I wrote a long time ago, the initial idea of it, but now I am thinking about the market. And I ended up actually switching representation to a much kind of like bigger reps. And I think the reason they want the book is that it's now.
Yeah. It's interesting how I just didn't expect you to be able to reuse stuff like that. Now it makes perfect sense, but that's fascinating. And I'm sure you both have like, tidbits here and there of like ideas floating that you're kind of waiting to jump on, right? But I think timing is just such a big piece of that. One of the things you just mentioned that I'm like, oh, what's that? Writing group. What does that mean?
Ooh, writing group. That's like the best part of being a writer are your friends who are writers, right? Wouldn't you say? Like the people who will gossip with you about the secret things that are happening. You all know who each other's nemesis are, and they're all really famous, and you're like, she's going down. If I'm ever in a room with that lady, oh.
We don't do that in children's lit. We're all friends.
But mostly it's supportive. But no, like I really love my writing group. I've had two kind of like, I'm kind of like in 3 writing groups at this point. One with one other person, Emily Rabideau, who writes a lot of really amazing climate nonfiction. She's like one of the leading climate kind of writers right now. And she has a book coming out in March, which is going to be incredible. Everybody should read it. It's so brilliant. And she's Black. She lives in New York. We met the first day our first books came out when we were like 28. And so we've really seen each other through our whole career, and that support is really amazing. And then I am in a writing group with 3 other people who I started working with during the pandemic when we were all just like Zooming together. 2 of them live in Seattle and 1 of them lives in Boston, and we've only ever been in all of our company once.
Whoa. And so
In real life.
how does that, like, is it just to talk about pieces of it, or you send each other?
Well, I think it's really valuable to have friendships with people, I mean, in any field, who are at the same space in their career that you are, because you can ask really practical questions.
Yeah.
And I think it's really tricky with writing because there's this specific weird thing about this job, which is that there's this way in which it feels glamorous. Like when people meet someone who's a writer, there's often this kind of conversation like, oh, you're a writer. But when you're really a writer, it's a lot of drudgery and it's very hard, and there's a lot of demoralizing things that happen. And so to have people who are in the same career moment as you saying like, oh, yeah, I know, that happened with my agent too. Here's the 3 things you need to ask her, and here's how you should craft the email so you don't sound like you're being ungrateful. Which you would never say to someone who isn't in the same moment as you, right? Like,
Yeah. And there's also this feeling of like you said, you haven't been in the same space as the same people. Like there are people that I have never met that I feel really close with just from being in touch through Instagram and then email. Conferences you maybe meet like once and then you're like besties forever.
totally.
But like I sent an email this morning because I was like, my agent just sent a manuscript to this editor, and I realized that that's the editor that's doing your book, to a woman I've never met before, but I feel like she blurred my last book, and we've been in touch, and so it just does feel like a really big like supportive community, even if you aren't like meeting as a writing
well, I
group,
think because
like, in a
everybody
cafe
knows
every day.
how hard it is.
Yeah.
I mean, and it is like this kind of like gauntlet by fire to a certain degree that people are like, oh my gosh, if you're asking advice, you really need it.
Yeah.
Right. And I have the advice to give. And there's this way in which it is very reciprocal. There's this idea of like, I'll blurb your book, and then in 5 years you'll blurb my book. And
Sorry,
you know,
blurb your
Blurb
book.
Blurb is like the little quote on the cover on the inside by like another author, and you're
It's
like,
like-
oh, I love that author, so I'll buy this book.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're welcome, everyone. 'Cause I was like, what are they talking about? Blurb your book sounds like something you wouldn't want them to do, but what do I know?
it's like, I would say it's probably like the most hated part of the job that most people feel about, like people who are asking someone to blurb their book. It's like mortifying.
Yeah, it sounds.
People, especially when you're starting out, it's like,
Hi.
hey, you're really famous.
That is.
I admire
Oh,
your
that
book
makes
so
me-
much.
yeah.
Would you read my whole book and write something nice about it? It's
Has
horrible.
that ever happened where they said yes, that they read it, and they were like, ooh, I don't have a blurb for you, actually. I can't blurb you.
This is why I always say, like, I'll give it my best shot.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have time. I'm a
Yeah.
mom.
Yeah.
Throw the kids right under the bus.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Every time.
Yeah. It's always a good
And then you have a
move.
little time to look at it and be like, not for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I got so busy. Sorry.
I can't do it.
Yeah. So that is actually, you touched on it again. You just keep touching on. You're just nailing it. You have both of you, a very romanticized career, I feel like. A lot of people are like, ooh, a writer, right? And like, picturing you with your typewriter in a cabin, you know?
Click, click, click.
Yeah. And so is it as enviable as some think, or is the drudgery, all encompassing? Like, give us a little like behind the scenes. Let's be candid here,
We're not mining coal. So, like, comparatively, it's pretty great.
Yeah, sure.
I would say that I love the actual job. Like I do write in cafes, not in cabins. I like the background buzz. So I'm always in a cafe with like people walking behind me and listening in on conversations. And I love getting up in the morning and walking to Shelburne Village Wine and Coffee and like sitting in my little spot and. Is that good?
Yeah, perfect.
And writing the story, like even the parts of the novel that are trickier, where I get like a little writer's block, or like I know my process well enough to be able to hit those spots and be like, I know how to get through, and I love the day-to-day of it. Like I actually do love that. The parts that are hard are the businessy parts, the parts that you just don't have a lot of control over, and that's really hard to not have control. And like I have all this time and I want to hustle and I want to do all the things, and it's still like the market matters, and like who you know matters, and like, you know, who at this house is buying right now matters, and like whether they're on strike matters, and like all of this extra stuff makes it really stressful and hard. So I'd say the day-to-day, for me, I love being an author, but that part of the business part is so hard. It's really hard.
Yeah, I had a really fun conversation with my writing group today. I've been revising a part of my novel for this is the third time that my agents have been like, can you revise it again? It's been super demoralizing and hard. And I've been doing it since August. And I asked my writing group, I finally felt like I had it into place, and I asked my writing group if they would read it, if anybody could fast track it. And one of my friends was like, I'm going to Jackson, Mississippi to do an event. I'll be on a plane on Sunday. I can read it. And the other one was like, I can read it. And so we got on the phone today, and it was like the best hour of my life, because they were like, we love it. And also, have you thought about doing this? You could do this thing with her. And it's like playing pretend. It's like that feeling. Do you remember when you were like a little kid and you got to play like a delicious game of pretend with someone? Like, that's what it feels like when it's good. It's like you're in your own weird fantasy crazy world where you made people up, and other people are excited to be in that world with you, that whether that's the reader or your editor or other writers, or like, that's the best part of it. It's wonderful, and I love that part of it, and the rest of it is just a job.
Yeah. It sounds like kind of high highs, low lows. Like, you have to be okay for
and
kind
really
of a ride.
unfair things happen. Like,
Yeah.
and it's heartbreaking, because like people whose books are brilliant, that you are like, this book should win the Pulitzer Prize, sells less than 1,000 copies, and no one knows about it.
Yeah.
And it's like, it shatters your heart.
What's the last book each of you read?
The last.
Be honest, please.
No, the last the last book that I finished. I read a lot of middle grade, mostly middle grade. I have a grown-up book club now that's pushed me into grown-up novels, which are also very good.
You're like, dang, this is dense.
It took me forever.
What a confidence booster that must be. Just like, crush that.
Totally. So it was a middle grade book that I finished last, and it's the one that just won the Newbery Award, actually, which is like the highest level of award you can get for children's lit. I can't think of the name, but it's Dave Eggers. It's like the eyes and the impossible, or the eyes and the possible, or something like that. But it's wonderful. It's told from a dog's point of view, which was always kind of fun.
That makes me want to cry.
Yeah. It's great. Yeah, I really liked it. I always try and read the award winners from the American Library Association.
Nice.
Yeah.
Right now I'm reading The Fraud by Zadie Smith. And I gotta say, I'm struggling with it, but I'm also sticking with it. So it's kind of one of those interesting reading experiences where I'm like, what is the thing that I'm resisting in this book? Why am I like not? Which is always interesting as a writer, because there's this extra level of like, where is the craft? Where am I? Why am I? Like, I would say the last book that I read and just was like, oh, I love it. Or a recent book that I read and just like was like, I love it, is the book Vladimir by Julia May Jonas, which is so wonderful and crazy and hilarious and dark. And if you haven't read it, everybody should read it. It's just
Look under your
delicious.
chairs. No, I'm kidding.
It's like about
We should have done that.
women's like female rage in this moment in like the most unhinged, fabulous, feminist way. It's just great.
Unhinged is my middle
It's
name.
so unhinged.
I love that. Okay, this might be like a little late to ask this question, but like, literally, how do you write a novel?
Oh my God.
Like, sorry, but like, characters, plot. Like, every time I'm reading a book, I'm like, I can't help but think like, how did they write this? Like, how do they remember this thing that happened in chapter 2, and then they circle it back around in chapter 11? I'm like, oh my God.
Revision.
Oh
That's
my
all the
God.
revision.
Well, the thing about writing is that everyone has their own process. So my answer is going to be really different
Love
than
it.
Miranda's, and you know, that's one thing about talking with kids is they're like, how do you, like, what do I do? Like, I'm ready to start. And I think part of being a writer
That's
is like
me. I'm the child.
is figuring out is like figuring
fine.
out your process. Like when I was a kid, I loved writing in like notebooks and on my own, but I really struggled with like how I was being taught the writer's process, which was, I don't know if it's the same. People in my generation might remember like brainstorming, drafting, or like choosing an idea, then drafting, and then revising, and then reading it with a partner, and then editing, and then you publish it. And that to me, like starting with brainstorming, they're like, it's just jot some ideas down, like anything that comes, like, and I like stare at blank pages, and I was like, oh my gosh, and I wanted to be a author when I was little. I like from age 9, I was like, this is my job, and I would like stare at blank pages and be like, watching like people that the writing process worked for, and I was like, oh my gosh,
I don't know how to do it.
It took me until really I was a teacher to figure out that like really everyone has a different process and a different way into a story, and like all of a sudden it was my job to teach like 32 of them at once, and I was like, oh my gosh, like, man, I had such brilliant students. They're middle school students in Washington Heights, New York, and they were so brilliant, and so I started teaching the writing process. And like one kid in my class was like, I can't brainstorm. I know that I want to write a story that's set in New York City though, so I'm gonna start there. And I was like, yes, like start with setting, you know? And like another kid was like, I want to write a story but I know the main character is just gonna be kind of like my best friend. And I was like, start with character, like that's amazing, yes, you know? And so I was like, well, I need to revisit writing too. And so I started writing more and more with my students, and I kind of figured it out alongside them, like my own process. And so for me, like a huge portion of my writing doesn't look much like writing at all. It's like me walking my dog or playing with my kids or, you know, doing all sorts of laundry and cooking and whatever it is, but I'm pretending that my character is with me, and I build my character for months without touching a laptop. I'll jot things down in a notebook, a little like bit of their voice that I hear, and so that's like months, you know, and that's active. Like that is me really like writing, and I need that voice to be so constant in my head that it feels like that character lives in my house and is like part of our family now, and I can hear him or her at like every stage of the game. Like if my kids are arguing, I know how that character is going to intervene or not. Like whatever's happening, like that character is like
crazy
there.
It's like method acting for writing.
So, yeah, and so that's, you know, that's a huge part of my process. And then I'm all notebooks. I'm like old school Uniball black micro pen in like unlined notebooks for the next couple months. Yeah. And then when I have to get on a laptop, I rewrite the beginning, the first 30 pages. I rewrite that like 10 times before I move on, because I love the beginning and I need to dwell there, and I need to like meet my character on the page and get to know her, get to know him, and then the next, and then, you know, so it's like all these little things come together, but it's just practice. It's just, you know, like we're all writers. We just have to figure out how we can tell our stories. We've got the stories in there, and we just have to figure out how to get them on the page. And so for everyone, it's a different process. Yeah.
You're blowing my mind. Okay.
The thinking part, that like we actually have a very similar process. Like I spend a lot of time just with my imaginary friends. But for me, the idea of a book often comes from a question that I'm scared of. So like, and it's often not the question that if you read the book, you'd think it was about. So like I'm really scared of white feminism, and I'm scared of it in myself. Mm-hmm. And I'm really fascinated by how does like toxic masculinity work in this country that allows women to become kind of like handmaidens of that. And how do I participate in that unknowingly and knowingly? And like my most recent novel, Fierce Little Thing, is very much about that. And I'm still working through that in this novel I'm working on, Do It Yourself. And probably if you were to read those two books, you'd be like, these are books about white feminism. But to me, that's like this like part of myself that I'm wrestling with, part of our culture that I'm wrestling with, part of these questions of like, how do you mitigate that? How do you fight against it? How do you unconsciously hold it up, right? And so like, as I'm working on this idea, what comes then is like these other people who've been kind of like in my brain space for a while, and they kind of show up again. I mean, it's a real trip to work on a novel that you wrote 15 years ago, because like I know them so well that I think they're real people, right? And then I'm like, and one of them lives in a version of my house. And so I'll be like revising a book, and I'm like, oh, and then she does it, and then I'm like, but that's not real. That's in my head. Like, she's not really in my house, but I think she is. Like, it's really
David, are you
weird.
safe, buddy? Yeah. Spooky girl. Wow.
definitely.
Is it, I mean, it sounds like you both really get like deep in it, right? And so are there times where you kind of like snap out in and out of it and reality? Like, are there times where you're like at the grocery store and you're like, oh shit, I was just in a completely different year with different people? Like, well, how do you interact with reality with that, right?
We are parents.
Yep.
Yeah.
I will say
yeah.
that, like, I will say at the end of a book push, David could say this, my mom, my sister are both here, they could both say this is true. At the end of, like, a book, when I'm really, like, finishing it, I do need to kind of just be like, I can't do any of the care. I can't feed anybody. I can't comfort anyone. I just have to, like, be in my own weird, crazy place. And then I come out of it and I'm like, oh, that was dark.
Yeah. I was just reading about the guy that played Elvis, and like he had to like hire a dialect coach to like get his real voice back because he did such he did like such method acting that he was like, I still sound like Elvis and I don't remember what my voice is supposed to sound like. So
There you go.
could be worse.
It's healthy.
So Lindsay, do you write books for children, specifically middle grade?
Yeah.
Do you think that's because you taught that age and you know the reader so well?
Yeah. So like I said, I wanted to be a writer of some sort from the time I was a little kid. And I was always writing. I was always taking creative writing classes and, always writing stories. And it wasn't until I was a teacher in a middle grade classroom that I was like, this is my audience. Like, these kids are it for me. I loved teaching middle school. I love middle schoolers. I think they are amazing. I think they're hilarious. I think I love that their emotions are like enormous and they bring them to school every day and they like on display, like lots to say. The thing I love the most about them is that their sense of justice is really high. There's like never a time when like, that's not fair is more prominent. And so reading books with middle schoolers is so exciting because they are never quiet. Like, my classroom was always loud, a good loud. and they just like, they judge characters like, I can't believe she did that. Or like, that friend is going to be so mad, or I would be so mad, or, and it's just like, it was so exciting and so fun every day that we read out loud together that then I knew that if I wrote books, I wanted to create characters for these kids to get loud about. I wanted like stories to be in classrooms. I wanted them to be read in families or in middle grade book clubs and libraries. And so I knew right away that I was going to be writing for kids. And then I started right there in my classroom. I started writing like actual stories for like literal kids sitting in front of me. Malcolm one day was like, Miss Stoddard, I want to read a story about a kid who like kind of gets in trouble a lot, especially on field trips. And I was like, okay, so I would like go home and write the first couple paragraphs and be like, oh man, I got stuck because I didn't know where they should go on their field trip. Can you help? And like, I'd give him the story and he'd take it home and write some. And, like someone else would say, I kind of want a story about like a girl who has a crush, but she's not really sure, and so like I'd go home and I'd write the first couple paragraphs and be like, I don't know what her parents would say, or I'm at the scene and I'm kind of like stuck, so can you take it home? And so we did a lot of writing that way together, and that's when I started writing for kids, was like I was writing for like actual kids, and so that's sort of what fuels my excitement for writing, is like imagining them being read out loud, and I work out loud a lot for that reason. Like if you ever do go to Village Wine and Coffee, you'll hear me, like in the corner, I'm reading it out loud as I'm writing to make sure
when we were sitting around the table, I heard you talking.
Oh yeah, no, it's like always, the mask era was wonderful for me. It was like, I'm constantly like working out loud and hearing it and listening to it and imagining it in a classroom or in a family.
I'm just like loving
wherever.
that, like in Shelburne, like your kids, their friends are like, I saw your mom talking to herself.
They're like, yeah, she does it all the time.
Normalizing. I love it. So one of the things I want to ask about, and I think it kind of dovetails here, is like cover art. Because one of the things I was going to ask you is like, why do you think kids pick up your book? And I think, maybe I'm generalizing. I assume most kids do in fact judge a book by its cover. I
We
know
all-
I
we
did.
all
Yeah,
do
we all
still,
do. So
yeah.
can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I am not responsible for the cover art, which always blows kids' minds. They think I'm quite the artist when I show up at their school, and I'm like, oh no, that's not me at all. Like I had nothing actually to do with that. So the design team at Harper, that's like all them.
And they don't give you like, do you want A or B?
So they don't have to.
Okay.
But I have a good.
Sorry,
I
that's
know.
blowing my mind.
So they don't have to. They can just pick a direction and kind of go with it. I have a good relationship with my editor, and she's awesome. So she'll send me like 3 directions that we're thinking of. Like we're thinking of this, this, or this. Like, are you drawn to one? And I can pick from there. Or in some cases, they'll send me like a sketch of what they think the final might be, and I'm like, can you like loosen up her braids? She's not so kept. She's kind of messy,
yeah.
you know, or like make the grandpa a little more
yeah.
stooped over. He looks kind of strong. And so like I can give little edits, and they again, they don't have to listen to that, but I do get like a little
Yeah.
peek beforehand at least. So yeah, that's all them.
That's
Yeah.
scary.
It's strange, and it's so exciting. Like when it comes into your inbox and it's like a bunch of PDFs, and you're like,
Yeah.
like I'm gonna look at Oliver for the first time. Like he's in my brain, you know.
Or
I already know
sometimes
how
you'll
he
get an
looks.
email from like someone in my writing group who's like, she's like, I'm trying not to freak out,
Oh no.
but they sent me the cover and
Oh,
I
no.
hate it.
That's what I was gonna ask. I'm like,
What
if
do
you
I
hate-
say?
you
And then
spent-
you're like looking,
oh,
you're like,
God.
okay. I understand why you hate it. You're right.
Oh,
But
no. But it's
it's
not that
gonna
bad.
be okay.
But the other thing is like that they do want the author to like it, because the author's
Right.
the one going out there
yeah.
and like, you know, selling the books and talking to the kids. And doing
With
all
every
the stuff.
one of my books, I've had veto power.
Yeah.
And then I feel like you kind of decide, I feel like you have kind of like in the process from like the time you sell the book until it comes out, you have 2 big hissy fits. Which can be nice. You don't have to be a jerk about them, but you can have 2 that you're like, no.
Like, is this the battle I want to
Like,
fight?
right. You
Yeah.
have to pick. You can only have 2 battles, and ideally only one. And there's usually at least one you have to have. But where you just put your foot down and you're like, absolutely not. I'm sorry. I will not accept that.
And
So
you might
sometimes
not want to
it's
waste it
about
on the
cover,
cover.
but you might not want to waste it on the cover if you're fine with the cover.
Have you ever hated one of your covers?
Yeah.
Really?
Oh, really?
Yeah, my novel Bittersweet, this one, so this is the hardcover Bittersweet. I couldn't find my paperbacks because my teenager has been reading them, which is weird.
Oh, I wasn't ready for that.
I know.
That made me emotional.
Bittersweet has like a house on the cover. It's kind of like, it's somewhat Saltburny, somewhat like without the bathtub scene. It's kind of like a Brideshead Revisited. It's like a story of like someone who comes home, meets like a poor down on their luck person who meets a very rich, very pretty person in college and goes home with them and falls in love with their family and figures out how to like belong in that family. And in this case, those people are women, which those stories are never about women. So I was like, I want to write that story about ladies. So right, it has this very aspirational house on it. And so then when my novel Fierce Little Thing came out, which is about a cult,
Oh, yeah.
which is a different publisher, they were like, we want it to be evocative of Bittersweet.
Oh.
Like we want there to be a house, right? But similar to what you were saying, the house was like in really good shape, and there was like a fence, and I was like, this is a cult in Maine in like in the 70s. Like it cannot look like this. And then when
It's a culty looking house.
the paperback
Yeah.
came out, they had proposed this as the hardcover, but they wanted to rebrand it as a paperback, and they wanted to use the hardcover that they'd used. And so sometimes they'll do that with a paperback because they want to kind of rebrand it because they feel like it didn't sell enough copies or whatever. And so and similarly, like I wasn't obsessed with this cover, but I was like, it's great, fine. Great.
Yeah.
I'm not going to fight that battle.
Yeah, I like it.
It's like a girl's face, but it takes a minute to find it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like it's also, this is popular, like the big.
At that moment, it was
Yeah.
really like, yeah.
I like it.
Thanks.
Interesting. I approve.
Sam likes it.
Yeah, thank God. Okay, Lindsay, there was something I wanted to ask you and I'm forgetting. Actually, there's a question I have for both of you that I want to jump to. What do you think, because we talked about like what you kind of write about, how you write. What do you think sets your writing apart from other writers in the same genre, writing about similar stuff? Like what, your writing groups maybe, or people that have read all your books, teachers, like what is it where they can say, oh, Miranda wrote this book? Like, is there a part of your voice you think that comes across, or is there another aspect of it?
I would say my work is really voice driven because of that work that I do in the beginning that I was telling you about. So the characters always have really strong, distinct voices. So I think that is sort of set apart. I also think the way that my books are put together, I think because I was an educator for so long, I know I like use my own childhood and the kids that I know to write directly to kids' hearts. But I also was an educator for so long, so I know what teachers and parents are looking for too. And so I can, not in like a I'm writing for grown-ups way, because I'm not. I'm definitely writing for kids, but I also use the same like professional texts that I know like really wonderful educators are using to teach kids how to read novels. And I purposefully put some things in there to help kids find them, you know, and to like search for them, because it's also good writing. It just is good writing too. So I think that knowledge of both sides of like remembering so many like big emotional moments from when I was a child and being able to use those on the page to write to kid hearts, but then also to have that understanding of what grown-ups of this age level are looking for in novels as well is helpful, and maybe sets me apart a little bit.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's really fun about having like a long career, which I feel like I can say now, is like
You've earned
you
it,
just
champ.
get better at doing it, and it's so fun because you're like, oh, I'm gonna pull this off. Like I'm gonna stick the landing on this thing. Like this book that I'm writing is so complicated because it's about these two women who are caught in this cat and mouse game with each other. And one of the things that's so hard about it is that one of the characters plagiarized the novel of the other character, and we know she's done this terrible thing, right? Very early on, we know that this has happened, and I have to figure. I'm so stressed out about how to make this character. It's not likable. That's not the right word, but how to make her like stick to itable, like to make the reader not be like, I hate her, I'm not reading this book,
Yeah.
right? And because she's kind of execrable in these ways, and my writing group is like, we're obsessed with her. We want her more. She's so bad. It's so fun. Like being inside her brain is like terrible and wonderful. And I was like, really? Like, how is that possible? And so I think one of the things that I'm really excited about in my own work is like, I think I have a lot of fun playing with these really big tropes of good and evil. And that's like a kind of a through line through my books. But really enjoying that like, kind of like almost like it's like a scale where it never settles hard on one or the other, and kind of just when you think you know which way it's going, it goes the other way. And that's something I think is unique about my book, which is really abstract. Answer your question.
No, I think it captures it. It's not a very like black and white question, right? I mean, I think I'll have to read all of your books and then I'll tell you.
Did I pass the test or not?
Maybe I'll start with Lindsay's. Those are more my level.
You'll feel like a rock star.
One thing I want to know about is agents. What's the deal? How do you get one? When do you get one? What do they do?
Yeah. And getting an agent is one way into publishing. It's the way that I went. The way that I got my agent was I wrote a full manuscript, and you should have a project done, I would say, when you're going to look for agents. They're looking for a full product that they can sell. So when I finished a manuscript, and I got it like revised to like the best that I could possibly make it on my own, I started to search, and I was reading a lot of middle grade because I am who I am, and because I was a teacher, and so I like knew a lot about the world that I was trying to enter, and I looked for some books that were similar to mine that I felt like, oh well, if I can find out what agent put that book out in the world, then maybe they'll like mine.
Smart.
And so I found like 8 to 10 like books, found their agents, and then wrote to them. And you write something called a query letter, which you can go online, and there's lots of like formats for that. But
And there are people who teach classes now
yes.
about how to write a query letter, which is, I think, actually worth taking if you don't know, because it's
they get tons. Yeah.
It's kind of like a college essay. It's like a specific weird thing that only fits that.
What? I'm
Yeah,
so glad I
I
asked
know.
that question.
So I wrote to those agents, and in that query letter, I was able to say like, I really admire this book that, that's your client list, and I teach that book in my classroom, and I think if you loved that book, or your readers will like this book too, and so that then, you hope to get a yes from there, and then the agent's job is to sell to the publishing house.
Wow.
Yeah, they're all the business.
That's so smart. Okay.
Yeah.
I had the same agent for a long time, 19 years, and I love her. And as kind of like as my career went on, and I also kind of like do TV stuff, right? So I have this other kind of aspect of my career, and I realized that I really wanted an agent who was able to hold all of me and not just my fiction, but who could kind of like be in a space where they were also like, I was also having a media rights rep and like a film to TV rep, and they were able to help me strategize about where it was worth me putting my effort. Because a lot of the life of a writer is like being like, am I going to commit to the next 3 years of my life on this project? Is it worth me committing? And I'm at a point in my career where I'm like, I would like other people to weigh in on that. I don't want to be the only one making that choice, right? Like I'd like other people to be like, yes, that's the right choice. So I ended up switching, and I'm now with UTA, which is a United Talent Agency. It's historically a film and TV agency, but they have a literary wing that's relatively new. And it's been really interesting to kind of rethink that question of like, what does an agent do, right? Because they're really they're much more involved than, I think this is partly the time, which is that editors now have a lot less time and energy to devote to actually revising a manuscript than that 20 years ago when I first started out, where like you'd sell a book at like 85%, and then an editor would take you those final 15% to like be like, and now we're ready to publish this. Really what editors want now is a book at 99%. So they can take that 1% of work, and then they're like, we did it. And then they push it out into the market. And so my agents are much more involved in revising this book than they ever have been, than I've ever had the experience of. And it's been really interesting to have that conversation much more on like a marketing level. And I'm at a point in my career where I'm like, I want that. Like it doesn't feel like selling out to me. I feel like, how many more novels do I have left in my lifetime? I'd like to maximize my capabilities with that. I'd like to sell a lot of books. That would be nice for me. So to have agents who are kind of thinking more in that landscape is really different for me, but I think is a lot more where the industry is headed than where it was when I started out.
It's a brave decision.
It was really scary.
That must have been hard.
It was also just heartbreaking.
I was just going to say, I'm like,
Yeah.
ooh, you had to break up with her.
Yeah.
And she's elderly, and I just
Oh, Miranda.
love her.
Jesus.
And it was a real, like, I cried a lot.
Oh.
I'm sorry.
I felt like I had to, like, it was hard.
Yeah. Can you talk about your TV stuff? You
Yeah.
teased us a bit.
So my sister Kai is over there.
Kai, raise your
Raise your
hand.
hand.
There she is.
And she and I are developing Bittersweet as a series with a production company, which has been really cool. We've gotten to pitch at a bunch of places, and we're writing a pilot right now, and that's really exciting. And that like kind of opens up other doors in terms of development. Hollywood is in shambles right now. I don't know if you followed any of that. It's kind of a dark time in Hollywood. So that's an interesting thing. But what's kind of fun about being not someone who's coming from that space is like there's not much expectation. It's like, I don't know, maybe we'll sell a TV show.
Who knows?
That'd be kind of weird.
Yeah. Kai's like, what? I was thinking it was really confident, but okay.
Yeah. Guys, we have a lot of conversations. It's like, maybe we'll sell it tomorrow. Maybe we'll never sell it. Who knows? We'll just keep going.
Amazing. It sounds fun, though.
It is fun. I mean, it's really fun to, like, it's fun, too, to work with my sister because we have such a mind meld, obviously, and we can never not work together. So even if we have, like, the biggest fight in the world, we're still related to each other. So
Yeah, we sometimes recommend, but often don't recommend co-founding with a family member. But here we are.
Here we are.
One thing I want to talk to you about is we've talked a little bit about like writer's block and what inspires you, but like what fuels your creativity? Like what if you do have writer's block, or maybe you are about to start a new book, or like what gets the creative juices flowing for each of you?
Yeah. My writer's block is always has always been, I should say, in the same place in the book, which I love the beginnings. Beginnings are so fun. They're so fun. Like
So much hope.
Just hope.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just
And like
hope.
everything's in front of you and you've got it all figured out in your head and you're like, yes. And so I rewrite the beginning a lot and I'm really into it. But then, and my family knows when I've reached it. The murky middle is like, ugh. And like it's like I just like the brakes slam and I get frustrated in that place because I know where I want my character to end up. At least the feeling, if not like the scene. I know where I want them to end up, but I don't know how to get them there. And so that's the part where I'm like, oh, and I'm such a character-driven person that like the middle needs to be like full of plot. And I'm like, oh, plot, like stuff has to happen. Like I have to make it happen on the page. So that's always a really tough spot for me. But the thing I have always done, and this was advice from an advisor at Vermont College of Fine Arts, where I got my MFA, he said, whenever you hit that spot where you're like, what am I doing? Go back to something that you wrote that you loved and like reread it and figure out what it was that like got you started writing this in the first place. And so for me, that's always like back into the notebook. And I'll go back into my notes from like maybe a year before, months before, and I'll read like a fragment of a sentence about a character where I was like, oh, I love that, or like just that sentence, or, and he says, my advisor said, sometimes like your subconscious will leave you clues in the beginning to get you through the murky middle. And so like I will go back and I'll reread the beginning. Like I will like quit trying to write the middle and I will just go back and reread the beginning until I'm like, oh, wait a minute.
There's this character there who
Yeah.
just like is in one scene, but
Yeah.
what if she's the one?
Right. And like for
Yeah.
like, I don't, for Brave like that, I got to the murky middle and I went back to the beginning and there was like one of the things that I did when I was creating this character was I had gotten a new dog and I was out in the woods a lot with my dog and I was like, oh my gosh, like I was writing about running with my dog and I was pretending that I was this character and trying to figure out how this character would be and I was like, we need a dog. We need like a dog to get through the murky middle and like, so there are just some things that are like kind of dropped into a notebook or like something that'll just be a little clue that can pull you through and like pull some of those strands from the beginning through to the end. So I always just go back to like something that I loved that I was like, yes. And sometimes it's like a conversation. Like I'll go back to like text chains with like friends. I'm like, I have an idea. Like I got a new character. And I'm like, oh, see how excited I was. Like I have to remember
Channel
that and
that.
like
Tell
get back
me
to that,
you like
ooh.
find a note that you're like, damn it, what does that mean? Like
Oh, all the time.
like soccer ball, and you're like,
Those like middle of the night notes where I'm like, I just solved everything.
Yeah.
You like text yourself some garbage.
I would say that for me, it's similar. I find a lot of inspiration from other makers, especially people who I personally know who are making amazing things in the world. It's really gratifying to see like, oh, this person has made this incredible thing. Oftentimes it's someone who I've known through the process of their making. So like I've had a lot of conversations with them struggling with the incredible thing that I know they made. And so it's often like coming to the other side, like someone in my writing group is this really amazing critic and nonfiction writer named Claire Dederer, who wrote this incredible book called Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma, which is all about, it's a nonfiction exploration. It's kind of like a stream of consciousness through the question of like, what do you do with the art of monstrous men? So men who have committed horrifying crimes, who made incredible art. Are you allowed to consume that art? How do you relate to it? What do you ask yourself about that? Are you complicit? If you know Woody Allen did what he did, if you know that Roman Polanski did what he did, but you love Roman Polanski's movies, are you allowed to watch those movies? And she kind of goes on this exploration journey of, what do I do about that, right? And she's in my writing group, so I read that book in draft many, many times, and that book was a New York Times bestseller, massive massive book. And like most of the conversations I had with my friend Claire were like, I hate myself. I'm so stupid. I hate it. It's dumb. Can I do it? I don't know. I'm so scared. Right? Like, are people going to be mean to me on the internet? Like all of these conversations that like I have all the time.
Yeah.
So then you read this incredible thing that this person has written that you're like, this is a work of genius. Like, this is this important work that is so vital to our moment. And everything, every word in it feels like it's like gilded in gold. And yet, like, I know, like, also then my friend wrote it. And I was friends with her the whole time she was writing it. And it was like agony for her. And so that in some ways always makes me feel better, which is weird. But it always makes me think like, I can do that. I could keep going.
Yeah. Almost seeing someone else go through it is like, oh, I can. You can do it.
And also like if she can do it and she wants to do it and she keeps going, why don't I think like I owe her that? Like I was in this exercise class for years in New York, and there was this woman in my class, Beth, who I loved, who had she was a single mom of 3 kids who were under the age of 10, and she would show up to these exercise classes in Prospect Park in the dead of winter where there were rats running around we would like exercise on the ground, and every time I would be like, I don't want to go, I'd be like, Beth is hiring a babysitter
just
to
so
go
she
to
can
this
work
class.
out. What's your excuse?
And if Beth can show up, I can show up.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, man, I'm gonna remember Beth.
I gotta say, your female friends,
Yeah.
the women in your life
Yes.
are like all you need to feel the inspiration of doing the impossible.
I'm gonna try to remember that, but all I can think about are the rats.
There are a lot of rats.
Oh.
One time we were exercising and we were underneath a tree.
No,
This is the funniest thing that's ever happened.
this is my nightmare.
And a raccoon just
Nope.
fell out of the tree, like 4 feet behind my friend, and she was like, and then we all just started screaming, and this poor raccoon was like, oh, these humans, and ran the other direction, and we were like, this is pretty weird that we're
Instant
doing
max
this.
heart.
I was gonna ask her why she moved out to New York, but don't need to do that anymore. Y'all want to ask some questions? Yeah, maybe. We got some questions in the crowd. Great. Where's my mic guy? Is this gonna work, y'all?
Where's that button?
Oh, I see it. Thanks, Dave. We got
Thanks,
a couple
Dave.
questions.
Y'all doing great.
Thanks, Dave.
I can't see. Who had a question?
Hi. Oh, I'm really loud. My question is about book marketing. I guess my question is, it sounds like there's kind of nothing you can do and it's all luck, but if you were someone whose first book was coming out and you had, I'm sort of in the void between selling the book and the book coming out in like a year. And everyone seems to say, like, kind of shrug when it comes to the talk about sales and marketing. So I guess I'm wondering, are there things that did work for you if you were trying to decide now where to put your energy? Like, what would you do? Would you learn TikTok? Like, do I need to learn?
I mean, I think TikTok is pretty, I will say TikTok is pretty easy to learn, and it's pretty fun. I think the thing about TikTok, like with every social media platform, you have to learn what it is, and TikTok is just like weird. So you just have to be as weird as you are, right? And celebrate that. I think that, but that goes to a larger question, which is like, I think having a newsletter is really important, and writing about the things that you care about, because that's what will sustain you to do it. You will show up to write on your newsletter because you're writing about the birds outside your window and you're a passionate bird watcher, or you're writing about some other thing that you really care about, and that might dovetail with your project. It might not, but it'll mean that people feel like they know you, and I think that that's like the most important thing. Some people don't want to do that, and that's okay too, because that's like selling a little bit of your soul. But if you figure out a way to compartmentalize a little bit and be like, I'm going to sell this part of my soul, and the rest of it is for me. That's a way to be in those spaces and not feel terrible about yourself. I mean, Substack is great. I mean, the thing that's great about Substack is then you can charge for, like, you can figure out how to kind of like charge for the parts of whatever you want to write about that feel harder to write about or more you want to write more about. And then you can also have like your free space that's a little more, I think it's kind of choosing one or two things and just being like really committed to it. But I will say my final piece is I do think it's important to be cultivating a newsletter and not just relying, as we all know from Twitter, on a social media platform, because
Who knows?
I know a lot of people who put everything into Twitter, and that's gone now.
I would also, one of the things that I wish I had done earlier, I think I was just so, I know that I was just so excited that I got a book deal, because this was like my 9-year-old childhood dream, that I was like, yes, and I was afraid to almost ask, like, what are you, HarperCollins, doing for me? And yeah, I'm just so like, you're doing this, you're going to make me a cover, like, that's amazing, like, I was just so like, just felt so like grateful almost, which feels weird. And like, I just wish that I had a 1-year-old and a 0-year-old and zero space in my brain. So I wasn't quite like with all that part of it, but I think that I would, ask, what are you, like, what's the marketing team doing? Like, what's your plan? I want like a plan. You can, and use your agent to
your
help you with
agent
that.
is critical.
So that
with
you don't have to have that voice if you don't want to, but you and your agent should find out what your publishing house, what their plan is, and then don't be afraid to say, like, what do you think I should do then? Like, where can I fill in some gaps to do stuff like that? But yeah.
It's also space to ask, I just want to add one quick thing. It's also space to ask your agent or to have a conversation with your agent, and you can know the answer to this question. Do you want to know if things are bad? Because one of the things that agents know, they've been in a million of those meetings, they know if it's going bad. But oftentimes agent will protect you because they don't want you to have hurt feelings. And I'm someone who would so much rather know the ship is sinking so I can try to do something about it and, I don't know, research what you do. But some agents won't do that. So it's also about saying to your agent, I want to know if things are terrible. Tell me, please. You have a question.
I do have a question. Sorry, guess I'm not good at using the mic. I guess I'm just curious, when is the moment when you know that being an author is your job, when you can, finally quit your day job? What was that? I guess it could be different for both of you, but when do you know, like, for certain, I'm an author and that's my job?
God, that's so complicated. I know it's
a good question.
We're both squealing. For me, it was an interesting path just because I was becoming a new mom in the same moments. So I had and I was a full-time teacher, and I didn't expect to leave teaching. I left in June, and I had a baby in July, and I signed the book deal in June. And I thought I was going back to my classroom in September. And like the whole summer was like, whoa, like you have a new job and a new job, and like, whoa. And so for me, I had to choose either like full-time childcare and then balancing a 2-book deal and teaching full-time, or I was going to take on full-time childcare myself and do the book deal at home. And so I feel like I kind of got pushed out of my day job a little bit. And I wasn't expecting to leave teaching, so it was, so that moment was a little bit more of an easy decision. And I guess.
This is maybe hypocritical.
And also the book deal, even in 2016 when it was signed, was a lot more than what the advances are now. So the advances from my book deal matched or exceeded my teaching salary, so I felt like that was okay at that time. It's not quite like that anymore, but.
This is hypocritical because I quit my day job when I sold my book, but I would say there is nothing better than having a really good side hustle, especially if it's not in the publishing world. I mean, I think if there's any lesson to be learned from what happened with SAG-AFTRA and the WGA this past year, like all my friends in Hollywood are losing their houses, right? They are, because they have given their whole lives to writing and being in Hollywood, acting, writing in Hollywood, and that industry shut down and is still shut down, honestly. People there's no jobs right now. And so like, everyone who's doing okay are the people who are like, yeah, well, I kept my job doing physical therapy, you know? So if you can have a job that you love that does something else that isn't just in the writing world, I think it's so worth doing. I think that's not a sign that you're not a writer. I think that's a sign that you're like a really smart business person.
Totally. Yeah.
Mine's not a big question, but out of curiosity, how many books do you guys read per year or per month or?
I don't.
Not as many as I want to.
I don't count. I'm not like on Goodreads and counting.
Yeah, not either.
But
I probably read like 2 or 3 books a month.
yeah, I think.
But I also read with my kid, so like maybe more than that.
I always have a family read aloud going, and then I read like 1 grown-up book a month and maybe like 3 or 4 middle grade books a month.
And then I'm often usually reading like at least 1 book that's in some kind of process of the publishing process, like about to come out, or a friend has written it and is asking me to help them revise it, or I wish I could read more books. Like oftentimes it comes down to like, am I going to write my own book or am I going to read someone else's book? And that's like a hard choice to make. But the other thing that's hard as a reader for me is like, I can't just enjoy reading a book anymore. Like every time I'm reading a book, I'm figuring out, I'm analyzing like,
Oh no.
how am I thinking about this, and I mean, there are moments when I'm leaving that, but like that's my experience right now reading the Zadie Smith book, is I'm like, this is interesting. Okay, I'm resisting it. Why am I resisting it? What choice is she making? This is a flashback. Okay, interesting. Like we've had like 5
wouldn't have
chapters
done
without
that.
flashback. Now we're in flashback. Okay, would I have made that choice? Like there's a lot of that, and that can be annoying. And then I find that the books that I love are the books where I just like forget that I exist.
So I'm going to bring up the T side of VSET in here because I think you brought up with WGA and SAG-AFTRA, like one of the contending parts is AI. And knowing that you all know your personas and you know that your work is also out there, like how nervous are you, given where the industry is going, and kind of what are the concerns that you may have about it?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I think I'm a dreamer.
I was gonna say
I'm
similar.
hopeful, and I do think that there's something very, I don't know, there's something very beautiful, like just like, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm just so scared that I've put it completely out of my mind, you know, that I'm like, oh, you know, that's so like weird and out of my world, and like I don't understand it enough to like really be frightened by it. But there was this thing going around where like authors could type in their names and see if their books were being used, and mine are.
Mine too.
And so like that reality was a little like, oh, you know, like, and there is a lawsuit going on that's, you know, I think it'll encompass all of us, but like the biggest voices are like in charge of that. But so like I'm aware of it and it's there, but I'm also sort of like, I don't
I
have
think
any
maybe
control and I
I'm
don't know
more
what to do.
concerned about nuclear war from AI than I am about someone plagiarizing, like AI writing a novel that competes with my book. You know, I think I'm more concerned about like, and I'm less concerned about AI than about like the people in charge right now. So like, you know, there's a lot of other stuff to worry about, it seems like to me.
Where is it on your priority now?
Like, you know, like my last night, my 3 a.m. terror session was not about AI.
Yeah. We'll keep you posted.
I assume that everybody in this room is really interested in the humanities. And I also know that we have an author and an educator who obviously are living the humanities. And this is a huge issue, particularly in public education now in many states. And I'd just like to hear how you think about it. You're young women in the middle of your careers with a future ahead of you. And I'm interested in where you see this battle for getting empathy, which of course is what fiction teaches. It helps us know how other people live and, you know, warms our hearts to people we never even imagined until we open the pages of your book, even people we don't like.
She pointing to me? It's awkward. She went
Yeah,
like
I'm
this.
pointing
Yeah.
right at you. But in other words, like I'm old now. And so, and having taught my whole life, it's very easy for me to begin feeling despair, except I just adore kids. And they're not
Yeah,
cynics.
kids are the best.
They're not cynics. They
are
want to
great. They are the
believe that, that
They're the best of us.
Charlotte really wrote those words. And I just would like to hear you riff on this.
Well, we've both been reading the Vanderbeekers with our kids.
Yeah.
Has anybody read the Vanderbeekers book series? Everybody needs to read these books.
They're so good. Yeah.
There's 7 of them in the series. They're so great. They're so full of love. And one of the things that's been the most fun is like with my 7-year-old, just hearing her talk about these kids, these 5 siblings who are in the book, and what she would do in their situations. It's about a group of kids who live in Harlem. They're siblings. They live in a brownstone. Their family is like perfectly middle class, but they struggle, as we all are. And they just, as a family, they try to solve problems.
Yeah.
And it's so fun to read this book with my kid, because she believes in them so much. And I think like that has been a really beautiful recentering of that larger question of like, I do think that people want to engage with these larger moral questions, and that fiction is the place to do it.
Yeah, I find a lot of hope in my classroom visits. You hear about book bans and just librarians fighting to have freedom of reading in their classrooms and in their libraries, and that's all true. And like we have to use our voice to stand up, and authors are doing a lot to rally around authors who have been banned. But when I go to school visits, like they're awesome, and there are teachers out there that are like reading picture books, like one picture book every single day of the school year, 180 picture books to their 8th graders. And their 8th graders are like edge of seat. Like it is happening. And it's not just in one, it's like, that's a movement that's been created by like this really wonderful librarian named Jillian Heisey. And she just created this thing called #BookADay. And she put it out on social media. She's got a loud voice, and now all of these classrooms all across the nation are reading picture books every day. And they're not like studying them. They're reading them and offering 180 other characters into their classroom so that kids can talk about other kids instead of the problems that are maybe happening in their families or in their classrooms. They can talk about 180 other kids that have been introduced to their classrooms. And that happens through read-alouds that happen every day in chapter books and in middle grade, and it is still happening. Like, people are using books and fiction. There are kids that are creative writing. Like, I go in for school visits just as much to talk about my books, but also for like helping kids write stories. Like, I do creative writing workshops, and there's like whole units about writing fiction and telling stories. There are like educators that are in TED Talk units and the Moth units, like in their auditoriums, and so like it feels okay out there with the kids, and they're in good hands. And so I think like if we just keep using our voice to make sure that that's true for all kids, there is hope there.
Let's end on hope, shall we? All right. Thank you all for coming out. Huge thank you to Lindsay and Miranda for their time. Make sure you come to our March 11th event to be announced, and buy their books. Come on, buy their books. All right.